Hello, this is Perry Peterson. Thank you for attending my session today on cyber regulations, friend or foe. It just happens to be my birthday, so thank you for attending. But in this session, we're going to take a closer look at cyber regulations and discuss whether they're an advantage or a disadvantage to improve the cybersecurity posture of the country. So how many past or present regulators are in the room? Obviously, I can't see your hands, but consider for a moment that you might be involved in a form of crowdsourced regulation. In this example on the screen, you can see how Amazon customers provide ratings of products and services. So this is one way to impact how companies perform. And you can argue whether it's a good thing or an effective thing, but it appears to work. I think the reason this cartoon is funny is because it is close to the truth. Although I have been a federal regulator, and I've worked with many, and I know their heart is in the right place, but sometimes they miss the mark. And so involvement by cybersecurity professionals is critical to help those in regulatory positions understand better the industries that they are regulating. I wanted to take just a moment to provide you my resume in the form of logos. So I started my career with the Department of Army as a motion picture photographer, which is how all cybersecurity people start out. And then I went to the Department of Defense and the Office of the Undersecretary of Defense, and from there to Department of Homeland Security, where I was the director for the Control System Security Program. From there, I went to the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, helped them develop the regulatory framework for cybersecurity for nuclear power plants, and then finished my government career working for Department of Energy at the Pacific Northwest National Laboratory. While I was at the Department of Homeland Security, one of the more interesting projects I ran was called Aurora. This is where we attacked a diesel generator up at Idaho National Lab. And the link provided gives you insight into a lot of supporting documentation and even the video that was released by the Department of Homeland Security. But relevant for our discussion today, my direct experience with this project illustrated how industry could push back against a known and documented vulnerability, and that regulation was still required to get folks to move and do what was necessary. When it comes to taking action and taking issues seriously, I have a very positive experience working with and for the NRC. After 9/11, as you can see in this timeline, the NRC took several actions. There was even an effort by industry to develop their own cybersecurity program and risk assessment methodology. But that progressed, and the NRC issued a regulation. So this was their response. But even after the regulation, it took a full 10 years before that regulation was fully implemented in the industry. I'll talk a little bit more about NRC later. When it comes to regulation, there are many different approaches. Here are two examples of ones that I'm the most familiar with. The process adopted by the NRC and the process adopted by FERC and NERC, who regulate the bulk electric system. So at the NRC, the driver is public health and safety, and that is easy to understand. On the grid side, it's reliability, keeping the lights on, and that's also easy to understand. But you need to observe the difference in the motivation behind the regulation, which results in a very different flavor. And the bottom line is that, for example, on the NRC side, there is a technical basis for the regulation and an agreement between the NRC staff and the commission, and then the rule goes into effect. On the grid side, they develop standards and then vote. So those who are regulated vote on whether to adopt the regulation. So you can see the result in the regulatory framework is very different between these two types of approaches. Another more academic view of differing approaches is comparing prescriptive and performance-based regulations. There are pros and cons to each, and they can represent a spectrum with various hybrid approaches in between. For example, the NRC's regulation 10 CFR 7354 is only 1.5 pages long, and it can be described as a performance-based regulation. It describes what is to be done. However, the guidance that the NRC provides, Regulatory Guide 5.71, is much more prescriptive in telling you how to protect those assets identified in the regulation. So that's a balance. The regulation itself is more performance-based, but the guidance is more prescriptive. So one of the major challenges in performance-based regulation and guidance is measuring performance. What do you measure? How do you measure it? Can security actually be quantified? And this debate rages on. I am paraphrasing Lord Kelvin when he says that if you cannot measure it, then your knowledge of a subject is of the weak and the meager, unsatisfactory type. And that what you're doing is not quite a science. And I think there's a lot of cybersecurity these days that falls into that category because we don't have effective ways to quantify cybersecurity. There's progress being made, but more needs to be made before cybersecurity matures to the point of being a bona fide science. Even if you agree with Lord Kelvin, we are still faced with the need to regulate certain industries. And this regulatory framework is often depicted as a pyramid. So every class I give on cyber regulations, this is how we describe this framework. So it starts with the laws within a country or a state, and then from those laws, regulations are built, policy is developed, procedures, and then the documents that exist down at the facility level, the cybersecurity plan, and all of the artifacts that help demonstrate compliance with those regulations. But in all cases, when you look at that very bottom level of this pyramid, you can still trace it back through procedures, policy, regulations, to the laws that make it all legal. And this is an important step, because if you're going to take an action against an entity that is not compliant with the regulation, you have to have the law behind you. One personal experience I had while working at the NRC in this regard of making sure that the law and the regulations are behind you is an exchange I had with a representative of the industry. And we were discussing a particular provision in the guidance. And I got the proverbial finger in the chest. Show me where it says it in the regulation. If it doesn't say it, we're not doing it. At that time, I was the regulator, so I won the argument. But I didn't win because I was the regulator. It's because I did my homework and made sure that the guidance was based on the regulation, and you could trace it all back to the underlying laws and legislation. So I was able to win that argument, and it was the right thing to do. In this case, Mark Zuckerberg was calling for regulation, not necessarily cybersecurity regulation. And for that reason, I looked at his actions as just a little bit suspicious. I'm not sure why an industry would be calling for more regulation. You could speculate on this, but I think it's important to question people's motives when they call for more regulation. When it comes to cybersecurity, I think I have good reason to support additional regulation, but I appreciate there are other perspectives. Here's a pop quiz for you. Are there more trees in North America today than there were 100 years ago? Well, according to the Food and Agriculture Organization, there are in fact more trees now than there were 100 years ago. So this is an example of the positive effect of regulation. And in this case, even a positive effect, not just simply because of the increased number of trees, which you might just think would be a good thing so that we don't cut them all down. But now we're also beginning to understand that this could also have a positive impact on the climate. So this is an example, I believe, of good regulation with a good result. During my presentation today, I've shared with you some personal experiences I've had, and this is one I had while teaching a class in Ukraine. And this photograph is actually the outside of the Nuclear Institute there in Ukraine. And I actually took this photograph. But while I was teaching the class, I had one of the engineers stand up and say, I completely agree with the advice you're presenting. Now go tell my manager to give me the budget. It's then when I began to appreciate the value of regulation in providing a basis to argue for the budget. Because at least if you're being forced to comply with a minimum set of regulations, you should be able to win that argument more often than not. And so I think there's some advantage in having regulations that will support then the engineers and the frontline managers when they go do their budget battles with the CEOs and CFOs. although this bill is not a law yet, I would support the adoption of it. And there's one example that I would share with you to indicate why. And that's because in the airline industry, when they adopted a similar type of rule to report near misses, that's when the safety record of the entire industry went way up. Prior to that, they only had to report a crash when one plane actually ran into another plane. But in this case, reporting near misses also contains information useful to the industry, and we should be reporting this as well. I'm sure you've heard the adage that compliance does not equal security. And while I would agree, compliance is not a bad place to start, at least when you have a situation where the industry, the practitioners, the workforce are perhaps not as mature as they need to be in this domain of cybersecurity. It's not a bad place to get started. But the disappointing thing is, again, reflecting on my experience at the NRC, is that a regulation is usually crafted with the idea of being a minimum set of requirements. The unfortunate thing is when it gets translated and promulgated into the industry, too often it becomes the maximum of what will be done. And it's difficult to get industry to invest and go beyond that minimum requirement. So regulators need to think about this carefully. Here is one example where industry efforts were on the right track, and then a government regulatory body was established, but it didn't seem to make a major sea change. In other words, there was a trend. There was a trajectory in the industry already underway. So you could argue that before OSHA existed, companies simply learned that it's not good for business to have unsafe workplaces. But who would argue against increased safety? And I'm sure OSHA has done a lot of good things, but this is just a data point to understand that this problem is multifaceted. So this is an example where industry was clearly pushing back against increased regulation. And I use this quote by then CEO of NERC, Jerry Cawley. The notion of a single government agency giving an order to direct changes in the grid is extremely dangerous. I don't quite agree with that. And the link is to an article I wrote on the topic back in 2014. So you can take a look at that if you're interested. But this is where we need regulators with deep experience on the technical side as well as the policy and regulatory side. So in conclusion, I think that cybersecurity regulations can provide net positive impact for companies, for industries, and for the entire country. But it is in fact a never-ending story. Just like cybersecurity, regulating cybersecurity is a journey. It's not a destination. So we have to continue this effort. One more thing. If you get a chance, please either click on the link or enter the URL and take a look at this one question SurveyMonkey survey and let me know what you think. Just trying to get a feel for your perspective on the proper role of regulation. Well, that concludes my session on cybersecurity regulations, friend or foe, for today. I believe there will be a question and answer period following this, and hope to talk to you soon. Bye.